I'm Audrey Mosleski of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. And on behalf of the Institute for Advanced Study and its Branigin lecture series, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to this lecture by Professor Tiya A. Miles of the University of Michigan. There will also be a reception after the Q&A. About a year and a half ago, in the midst of another episode of the recurring debate over the doll's role, which purportedly decides who can be declared Indian, Professor Brian Gilley, director of First Nations here at IU, and myself, recent past director of the Neil Marshall Black Culture Center, began discussing the possibility of a conference at IU on Native and African American relations. Meanwhile, I began teaching a graduate seminar on race and culture in the African diaspora, and on our reading list, it included Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom. It's an inspiring read. We had great class discussions, and it's a very brilliant, quite brilliant book. So even as our plans for the conference stalled, I began to actively pursue Professor Miles for a possible visit to Indiana University. She is so gracious. In the midst of the thousands of emails that she received after being named a MacArthur Genius Fellow, she even got back to me. And finally, after harassing her a bit, I received a positive response. Persistent students, does pay off. And I want to thank the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies for co-sponsoring this lecture, along with letters of recommendation and confirmation from the Department of History and American Studies, and of course the Branigin Lecture Selection Committee. If you're all at all like me, you wonder just how the secretive and anonymous MacArthur nominators come to a unanimous decision about who will receive the coveted award. Well, I think I have a better idea now after having read Professor Miles' work. She has written 2 books on the relationship between the Cherokee Nation and African Americans, and has managed to be both thoroughly original in her arguments and convincing in her evidence, relating the complexity of these relationships in clear and engaging prose, which my graduate students truly enjoy. One of the paradoxes of this relationship, she argues, is that the Cherokee adopted slavery and enslaved African people as a defensive posture to demonstrate their sovereignty as a nation, and that they were in fact, quote unquote, civilized as a people. In conducting her research for her 2 books, she met with opposition on various sides. This is a book that shouldn't be written, some told her. Obviously, she didn't listen, and we are glad for it. To quote Professor Miles, in my work, I want to push history past its normal boundaries. Tiya Alicia Miles is a native of Cincinnati. She received her A.B. degree in Afro-American Studies at Harvard, her M.A. degree in Women's Studies at Emory, and her PhD in American Studies from University of Minnesota. She is presently the Elsa Barkley Professor of African American and Women's History at Michigan and chair of the Department of African American Studies, where she holds appointments in gender studies, Native American studies, and history. Besides her very active scholarly life, she is also director and founding director of Echo Girls Project in Michigan, whose mission is environmental awareness and stewardship of the environment, while teaching inner city girls and girls of color leadership skills and cultural education. Today, she is going to focus on her new research on Detroit. It's a fascinating story, Detroit, then and now. Professor Miles raises important questions about the future of this iconic motor city, whose music provided the soundtrack for many baby boomers like myself. the lives that they lived back in the day. To many, however, Detroit has become an easy punchline. So I, as well as you, I'm sure, am looking forward to hearing Professor Miles complicate that narrative. Please join me in welcoming Professor Miles.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am really thrilled to be here, and I was very excited to receive the invitation from Professor McCluskey and also Professor Bodner. And I want to thank Ivana Hedden for all of her hard work in organizing my trip. I have to warn you up front that I'm battling a cold, so I need to apologize in advance if I need to take a sip of water or even have a cough drop. So this is the very first time that I will be presenting material on my new research project, which has to do with the history of Detroit. So this is a great opportunity for me to share what I know so far and to ask you during the Q&A period to please share your thoughts and feedback with me. Detroit is a loaded cognomen these days. It carries with it heavy symbolic meaning about the present and future, not only of the Rust Belt Midwest, but also of American cities writ large. In public discussions about the current state and diminishing prospects of the post-industrial American city, Detroit is often viewed as a canary in the coal mine, or, less frequently, as an accidental test case for drastic economic and social decline. What you see on the slide here are two recent images from 2012 of Detroit. On the far left is the cover of the book by George Galster that just came out called Drive in Detroit. And you see on that cover representations of Detroit now that are in conflict. You see abandoned buildings on the top right and the bottom left that have graffiti on them. And you see this attempt to make a shiny, modern Detroit, to remake the auto industry, to remake the downtown area with the bright lights on the other sides of the front cover. On my campus, there are a group of people right now who are reading this book together in an attempt to try to see if there is the possibility of the formation of a new school of urban studies that should be focused on Detroit. So we're going to be having a major campus discussion of this book coming out very soon. And on the right, you'll see an image. This is really the cover image of the recently released documentary film called Detropia. If any of you saw the documentary Jesus Camp, it's made by the same people. And Detropia is a film that's been receiving positive acclaim. We also saw it on campus together, a large group of us in our historic theater. There was a large discussion afterward, and then there was a panel discussion a week later to talk about the representations of Detroit in the film. And some of the themes that came out were that this documentary is beautifully filmed, it's really atmospheric. One person said they felt like this documentary is so gorgeous that it's almost like a blues song in the way that it flows. And yet there are many people, especially people who live in the city, who feel like this film is yet another version of what's been termed ruin porn, another version of a representation that says that Detroit is on the decline. And so you see in this image here in the background this gorgeous old crumbling building. In the foreground, you see young white artists who have moved into Detroit. So while scholars in urban planning and sociology sort through definitions of a new kind of urbanism that Detroit may represent, community members and academic partners search for ways to build constructive change and to shape new visions for the city, which is meaningful not just to the city's residents, but also to the state's residents and to the region's residents. I can't tell you how often I travel and people ask where I'm from, and they seem to feel disappointed for me that I live so close to Detroit. In fact, Detroit, in many ways, I think represents Michigan for lots of people out there. So as an Ohioan by birth, a student of history, and a practitioner of public history, what I think of as history on the ground or history in the streets, I feel that the exploration and reconstruction of Detroit's past can be part of that joint community and academic effort to re-envision a viable future for the city, and indeed for the Rust Belt Midwest as a whole. So I take as my point of departure for this approach the critique of a Detroit historian, Charles Bright, who has written the following, quote, The dominant historical discourse on Detroit is one of rise and fall, spiked by an immense nostalgia for the city that once briefly was. The recent past is often deployed as a cautionary tale about what goes wrong with urban spaces when racism, white flight, and industrial evacuation undercut a city's viability. Such a historical construction places Detroit in a past that is now lost and irretrievable, and leaves current residents dangling at the end of history with little hope and no agency. There is a strange disconnect between the history of the city and the people who live in it, end quote. So my new research project is an attempt to restore Detroit to its history. This presentation that I prepared for you today, in particular, explores the notion that the challenges Detroit faces in the present hold similarities to the challenges the settlement confronted in its early years. In the late 18th and early 19th century, when Detroit was first incorporated as an American town on the British-Canadian border, it was a new kind of place within the U.S. socio-political landscape. It was a military and fur trading outpost in what was considered the western frontier. It was French in personality, British in administrative practice, and Native American in geographical context. Detroit residents had to negotiate and to set terms around international boundaries and relations, economic viability, intercultural exchanges, racial categories of slavery, political efficacy, unexpected disaster, and war. Through a reconstruction of early Detroit in the first American decades, this lecture addresses the aforementioned themes and considers the question of whether understanding Detroit then can help to shape visionary thinking and action for Detroit now. So only around 2 years ago, I started researching Detroit. My scholarship has in the past, as Professor McCluskey said, really been focused on Native American and African American relations in the U.S. South and Indian Territory, which is present-day eastern Oklahoma. And I looked quite a lot at slavery in the Cherokee Nation in that previous research. My Detroit interest was really sparked, probably 5 years ago, when I took a class of mine on a local Underground Railroad tour. And the tour was organized by a local African American Cultural and Historical Museum. And it was hosted by someone who I would say was sort of a booster for the area and really wanted to make people aware of and to celebrate and champion the notion that Michigan had been an abolitionist place. So I learned on that tour that Detroit was a major point of crossing for runaway slaves, and that 19th century abolitionists took pride in Michigan's identity as a free state. For instance, radical abolitionist Laura Haviland, whose work on the Underground Railroad often took her through Detroit, said that slave catchers could not be successful in Michigan due to, and this is from her autobiography, due to, quote, a public sentiment that would not allow avaricious and unprincipled men to cast our persecuted neighbors back into the seething cauldron of American slavery, end quote. By the 1840s, Detroit had earned the romantic nickname Midnight among participants in the Underground Railroad because it was viewed as the place that fugitives would pass through on their way to the dawn of Canada, the new beginning of Canada. So after taking this tour with my students, I started going to public events in Detroit about the city's storied role in the Underground Railroad. And there have been more of these lately because of the anniversary of the Civil War, which is really bringing to public attention that war and also the backdrop of slavery. So in these various events, which were really interesting, some of them included descendants of people who had been fugitives or who had aided fugitives on the railroad. But in the course of these events, I found the stories very moving, but I also had this little voice in the back of my head saying, but what else was going on here? We can't always just look towards celebratory histories. So I wondered what the prehistory was of the Underground Railroad in Detroit. I wondered what had happened before all these valiant people did the deeds that were described on these public panels. So my question was, how did people in Detroit view Black liberation and social equality before the 1840s, when abolitionism really took firm root in Michigan? I found that there was a dramatic event that I hadn't known about called the Blackburn Riot. We might term it differently as the Blackburn Rebellion or protest, which took place in 1832. And learning about this event opened a window for me about this question regarding liberation and social equality in Detroit. So the Blackburn Rebellion or riot started when two Kentucky-born slaves named Thornton and Rutha, escaped from their masters in 1831. And they made it to Detroit, where they then married, and they were living safely for about a year. And they joined a black population of about 138 people in 1831 in Detroit. Then a visitor from Kentucky came to Detroit just on business, happened to recognize them, and reported back to their owners that he had seen them, and their owners hired someone to go and catch them and take them back to slavery. So they were arrested, they were placed in jail, and they were anxiously awaiting their forcible return back to the South. Meanwhile, members of the Detroit black community gathered in protest and demanded the Blackburns return. When their demands weren't met, these protesters decided to plan an elaborate rescue. So two African-American women in Detroit went to visit Rutha Blackburn in jail. They went to her cell. They actually had direct access to her in the cell. And one of those women traded clothing with Rutha Blackburn. So when the two women left the cell and passed by the jailers thought they were seeing the two visitors. In fact, they were seeing Rutha and one of the visitors. When they went back to the cell, the woman who was there was actually free and they had to let her go. So Rutha then escaped and was taken across the Detroit River by African-American rowers. Her husband, Thornton, was still in prison, but there were saboteurs who were waiting outside by the stagecoach that had been hired to move him, and they took the pins out of the stagecoach so that it was stalled, which threw the situation into a chaotic moment. Meanwhile, African-American men moved Thornton to a horse-drawn cart that they had hidden. They took him to the woods, they cut off his leg irons, and they sent him across the River Rouge and then across the Detroit River. So the Blackburns won their freedom in a protracted fight and remained in Ontario until their deaths. After this incident, which was really upsetting to the white residents of Detroit, who had tried to maintain a sense of order and tried to maintain racial lines, a law that had already been on the books since 1827 was enforced. And this law required free blacks to register and post bond with the clerk of court. It had been on the books, but it wasn't really enforced until the Blackburn situation. So the Blackburn case illustrated for me not only a forceful black presence in the early history of the city and a committed communal struggle against slavery, but also the reality of a certain threat to black freedom and equality in a purportedly free city. The justice system in Detroit had colluded with Southern slave catchers, even in a state where abolitionist Laura Haviland later believed that, quote, it could never be done, and where she said, quote, let a slaveholder come and try us, end quote. Furthermore, the city had at the ready a statewide discriminatory law that was activated to forestall black protests through intimidating social and economic control. As I learned these things about the city through the Blackburn case, Detroit began to remind me of other northern locales, Boston and New York, for instance, that had accrued reputations as free places in the public imagination and as hotbeds of abolitionist activity, and had been associated as places where African Americans were relatively safe, but were actually places where slavery had been practiced for decades. I soon learned that Detroit, too, had been a place where race slavery was practiced and sanctioned from the middle years of French settlement in the 1760s through the ratification of the Michigan State Constitution in 1837. That was 1837. So now I'm working on a study of the city of Detroit during the first portion of the American period, which I'm loosely defining as the moment of the passage of the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 through the War of 1812. And as I work on this project, I may move that start date back to the Revolutionary War period or past the War of 1812. But for now, I'm just working within that period for the most part. So I'm tracing the history of slavery in the city, which I have found involved African Americans and Native Americans as slaves. And they were enslaved by French, British, American, and to a lesser extent, Native American people in the city. So in the process of trying to build a historiographical understanding of the subject, I was trying to grasp the shape and the content of the historical literature. I found that this early American period really seems to be the least written about moment in Detroit's history. Much of the work that's been done focuses on the period of French settlement and the fur trade in the 18th century, and then moves on to the boom years of the late 19th century and early 20th century, when American industry was on the rise and Detroit was a growing city and the kind of one of the most productive cities in the world. And then work later has looked at the motoring and Motown moment in the middle and late 20th century. But even these histories pay scant attention to the existence of slavery in Detroit, which is remarkable to me, given that this is a place that the Northwest Ordinance was supposed to have made free from slavery. That ordinance outlawed slavery in the territory that included Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And yet a number of studies of modern Detroit, as well as media stories and analyses of the city, point to racial separation and strife, to Black rebellion and white flight as major causal factors of the city's current deleterious state. Other causal factors most cited tend to be the economic crisis set in motion by the collapse of the auto industry and the loss of manufacturing jobs, and also ineffective or corrupt city government. Because I have a strong and even passionate interest in our nation's diverse past and how it relates to our shared present, I can't help but ask, how Detroit's history as an American city that can be characterized as a society with slaves might relate to its present condition, poised as it is often said to be, on the precipice of a chaotic post-industrial new urbanism that is seeded by racial conflict. So I would submit that when the history of slavery in Detroit is taken into account, the problematic realities of race relations, and indeed of labor relations, take on an added dimension that, if nothing else, lends historical perspective to a deeply rooted set of social divisions. Detroit was founded as Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit in 1701 by French explorer Antoine de Moth Cadillac. Cadillac chose the precise location for its strategic siting on a slight incline at the narrowest portion of the Detroit River. The incline would provide good sight lines and higher ground for the protection of the post, while the river would provide a sufficient way to move goods around the Great Lakes and the way of the St. Lawrence River into the Atlantic Ocean. In the 18th century fur trade, fur and especially beaver pelts were really popular across the Atlantic world. Native hunters would secure the furs, then trade them to French or British traders in exchange for European goods. Those French or British men would then sell the furs into European markets, where beaver furs were all the rage. So Cadillac's aim in founding Detroit was to draw various groups of the Native American, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Huron, Miami, and Ojibwe societies to settle around the new French fort as committed trading partners. One thing I've been trying to look into is whether or not there was a Native settlement in Detroit prior to the development of the French settlement. And so far, I haven't found that there was. It seems that Native people who were in Detroit were often moving through and around Detroit but didn't settle there. So when Cadillac tried to entice Native people to settle around the city, he was actually creating or trying to create new Native settlements. What Cadillac hoped was that he would extend and maintain French control of the lucrative fur trade in the Great Lakes and undermine British competition from Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. The French settlement of Detroit was unique from the beginning in both its aim to attract Native groups to settle on the outskirts of town and its commitment to agriculture. Unlike other founders of French forts and fur trading posts on the frontier, Cadillac brought a sizable contingent of 100 people along, including farmers as well as military personnel, and he established a settlement that was intended to develop the capacity to sustain itself over the long term. Within a few months, wives of leading officers had begun to arrive. The French established what are known as ribbon farms. Oops, let me back up and say, this is a plan of the town from the end of the 18th century. And you can see the village of Detroit at the front of the map. There's the river down below, and behind it is the fort. Here we go. So the French established what are known as ribbon farms, which are long and deep family farms of 400 to 500 feet in width that opened onto the river bank and backed into forested land. So I don't know if you can see this, but this big area right here in the middle, that's where the official formal settlement of Detroit exists, right in here. You see that? That's the fort that you saw on the previous slide. And then around here are these really long farms. Some of the richest people in Detroit lived in these farms, and I'll come back to them. Here's William McComb's land, and you'll hear his name in just a minute. And here's John Askin's land. So the farms were built in this style, and the homes were built also in a French-Canadian style with wood siding, sloping thatched roofs, massive chimneys, glass windows that were made with really small multifaceted panes, and peach, apple, and pear trees that were planted around the farms. Here's an example, an image of the early French homes in Detroit. As the population grew at the fort, that was becoming known simply as Detroit, it encompassed farms on both sides of the river. So there was a period when Detroit referred to settlement on what we think of as the U.S. side and also the Canadian side of the river. Settlers sought to take full advantage of the central waterway that flowed into Lake St. Clair to the north and Lake Erie to the south. As an economic hub for trade, as well as a food production center, Detroit had the need for a diverse labor force. People who could grow and process food, handle furs, assist in business transactions, man boats, and I use that verb purposefully, man boats, maintain domestic spaces, and so on. From the perspective of French traders and merchants, some of whom were becoming quite comfortable by the middle 1700s, that labor could be cheaply and adequately performed by slaves of various racial backgrounds. As historian Brett Rushforth makes clear in his new book on slavery in New France, France had legally condoned slavery in its American colonies. The 1709 Ordinance, which is titled Ordinance Rendered on the Subject of the Negroes and the Indians called Pawnees, stipulated that, quote, the Pawnee and Negroes who have been and who will be bought shall be owned by those who have bought them, end quote, and allowed that slaves, quote, are needed by the inhabitants of this country for agriculture and other enterprises, end quote. Rushforth points out that slavery was already legal and already practiced in French colonies, but this ordinance really set it in stone. So the slavery that was better known in the Caribbean colonies of New France was adapted to settlement in Detroit and adapted to the needs of those particular settlers. Leading French families owned male and female slaves of African as well as indigenous American descent who had been acquired excuse me, from the South in Indian raids and from the Western Plains in tribal wars in which captives were taken. The term Pawnee, P-A-N-I-S, came to signify an Indian slave in French and Detroit parlance. And though it would seem to identify members of the Western Pawnee tribe alone, Rushforth argues convincingly that the term cannot be read as a direct signifier and actually reference a range of peoples from Western tribes. So what's going on here is that in warfare and conflicts between Native people in the Great Lakes and Native people in the Western Plains, captives are being taken, those captives are brought into the Great Lakes, and they're being sold or traded or gifted as slaves. In addition, black slaves are being captured, again through Indian raids, from southern plantations and farms, especially in Kentucky, and brought into the Detroit area. That's how most of the slaves that were in Detroit at this time ended up being there. Excuse me. So as a result of the French and Indian War, France lost New France to Great Britain. And British military officers and traders came and settled in Detroit. Some of these military personnel, and especially traders, married into established French families. And like their French neighbors, British settlers acquired black and native slaves. Now, the means of obtaining slaves multiplied at this moment to include purchase orders from New York. There are examples of traders in Detroit who are ordering slaves from Albany. So it included purchase orders from New York, as well as the trade of slaves with other Michigan locations. And so far, we've only seen that taking place on Mackinac Island, which would be Mackinac Island in Detroit, but there may be more to find on that. Most of the economically elite families in town, whose wealth was built on a combination of fur trading and farming, owned at least one slave, and some had several. In 1773, there were 89 slaves in Detroit. By 1782, that number had doubled to 179, in part due to the fact that there was more social disruption during the Revolutionary War, and it was easier for Native people to raid Kentucky farms and to take slaves. In 1793, the number of slaves in Detroit had dramatically increased again to an estimated number of 300. Prominent British trader John Askin owned 8 slaves in 1787. 2 black men, 1 black woman with 2 children, 1 black woman without children, 1 black boy, and 1 Pawnee blacksmith. Askin was also known to have had an enslaved Native American wife named Amanat or Monat, with whom he had 3 children, which points to another dimension of slave labor in Detroit, sexual and reproductive labor. Prominent Scottish merchant William Macomb, whose farm you saw on that previous map, was the richest person and largest slaveholder in Detroit in the late 1700s. And by the time he died in 1796, he owned Grosse Isle, Belle Isle, many of you have heard of Belle Isle Park, he owned Belle Isle too, and 26 slaves who were valued at 1,655 pounds in New York currency. So I want to note here that in the context of the U.S. South, having 20 or more slaves placed a person in the category of being in the planter elite. So if Macomb had been in Virginia, he would have been among the planter elite. British military captain Alexander Harrow noted in his journal during the 1790s his many attempts to acquire slaves, and he especially tried to get boys, either black boys or Pawnee or Indian boys, and he tried to get women for what he described as country or kitchen work. Now at this point, you're maybe thinking something's gone awry, something's gone wrong in my chronology, because I'm talking about a slave population during the American period, when we may have thought that slavery had been abolished in the Northwest Territory and abolished in places like Michigan. And that's what I thought too when I first started doing this research, because this area is new to me, and I just remembered kind of a gloss of the Northwest Ordinance, probably from high school. This is the gloss I remembered from Article 6, although I didn't remember the article number. This is the gloss I remembered, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory." So what's going on? Well, what happened is that even though Great Britain relinquished this area on paper, the English never really left. They didn't leave the fur trading post because they were so lucrative until the 1790s after the passage of the Jay Treaty. And the Jay Treaty stipulated that if people who were British wanted to stay in Detroit, they had to accept American citizenship, but they could retain their property, including their enslaved property. So there are loopholes going on that allow people to maintain their enslaved property even though they are in a free territory now, which is the Northwest Territory. And the same was true for French settlers, if they say they could maintain their property. So I have here just some examples so that you can see some letters, and also you're going to see a part of the Macomb account book that shows how slavery was talked about in Detroit. And if I can find my page, I'll point out some passages to you. These are letters that are in the John Askin papers, first of all. And you see here in this first one in the bottom panel, his daughter saying, "I gave notice to several people that if they see your Negro, to arrest him and take him to you. And I told them what reward you would give. They promised to do it with pleasure." And in these 2 slides, you see again more mentions of slaves in the Askin family. There's a reference to my Negro Nabin, who has been found and who is afraid of being whipped for having run away. And there's another reference in the bottom of the first panel and the second panel about your boy George, who has been around some bad people, maybe getting some negative ideas. And I haven't looked very much into the Askin papers yet, so I don't know George's story, but I presume this to mean that George's getting ideas about running away. And you see here, again, in the Askin papers, a letter from John Askin to his son about his Negro wench, Madeline, who ran away. And then finally, I apologize for this quality. You can't see it very well, but this comes from an amazing source, an incredible source, which is the Macomb Record Book and Inventory, which is at the Detroit Public Library. And the first item in this account book is the list of the Macomb slaves with their values next to their names. So unfortunately, it looks like the primary material on slaves in Detroit is very spotty. The things that I've shown you are representative of what I found so far. And there are very few personal stories or kind of fleshed out narratives, fleshed out accounts that attest to the experiences of slaves in Detroit. I'm working on finding that and trying to understand that. But so far, I've determined that many enslaved people worked on farms, they worked in fields and in orchards, they worked in domestic spaces like kitchens, some worked in shops and worked on boats. Some were skilled craftsmen and women in the blacksmith and basket making trade. I haven't seen evidence of this yet, but to me it makes great sense that some would have been skilled at helping to prepare furs for the fur trade. And of course there's evidence that some were sexual partners to their owners. Just as important as their labor was, these slaves represented capital to their owners. And this is especially, I think, central in a mercantile settlement, that it was all about the movement of capital. So what I mean is that enslaved people could be sold for goods or cash, and they were. They could be used as collateral. This was really important. They could be used as collateral for large purchases and debts. And when Detroit was low on its food supply, slaves would often be used as collateral for Detroit to be able to buy wheat. And in this way, they provided financial security to their owners and to the settlement at large. As in other colonial and early American cities, many of these slaves would have lived in close quarters with their masters, in the same dwellings or in adjacent structures. Some attempted to flee their lives of enslavement, and they could do so by running north as well as south. The geographical lines denoting free and unfree space was blurred in this period, were blurred in this period, such that a man named Sampson, who comes up in Captain Harrow's journal, could run south of Cincinnati to secure his freedom, while other blacks were fleeing northeast to Canada. Slavery would be legal in Canada until 1833, when Great Britain abolished the practice in its territories, which meant that the traffic of escaping slaves moved in both directions across the Detroit River. Now, I know we're used to thinking about Canada as a free place where everybody is running to, but that didn't happen until 1833. So before that period, Canadian slaves were also trying to escape, and they were running across the river into Michigan. So it seems that that river was a really important topographical marker because it put significant distance between enslaved people and their owners. So I think that this activity of moving back and forth across the river to find freedom was happening throughout the period of slaveholding in Detroit. But it became most visible when Americans organized the Michigan Territory, which established a court that could hear fugitive slave cases. So once the court was there, cases started coming forward about slaves who were trying to run. So it was not until 1796 that the British actually handed over authority over Detroit to the U.S. military, and Detroit became an American settlement in more than name. The population changed little at that time, however. A handful of residents like John Askin, you saw his farm on the Ribbon Farm slide earlier. So a small handful of residents like him who wished to maintain British citizenship just picked up and moved all their stuff across the river to Ontario and started a farm there. A few American lawyers and businessmen ventured into the settlement, but for the most part, Detroit remained a French and British city with an American overlay. Although Americans could not legally own slaves in the city, parentheses, unless they were former British citizens who had slaves prior to 1796, so that's that loophole, Americans could borrow or rent slaves from others in the area. And to me, discovering this was really a surprise. I mean, every time I find something new, I'm just more and more frustrated and upset. I mean, I discovered this loophole situation others had known about, but I had not, and I was already upset about it. And then I thought, okay, well, Americans couldn't own slaves, right? But of course, you don't have to own human property to make use of human property. And Americans rented and borrowed slaves and had access to the benefits of cheap slave labor, just like the French and British settlers did. So by the time the Americans incorporated Detroit as a town in 1802, the population was decidedly multicultural and multiracial. It was French, British, American, Native American, and African American. And as urban studies scholar George Galster has put it, the metropolis is a palimpsest. I would take his language and move it backwards and say it's a palimpsest now because of all those layers of experience that we're starting to build up way back
Sorry,
then.
would you repeat that? I couldn't hear you.
Yes. So George Galster, he's the urban studies scholar whose book I showed early on. So he says in that book that Detroit is a palimpsest, so that it's a place where you have layers and layers of experience and meaning and stories on top of one another. And, yes. And I just take that and read it backward and think about how that palimpsest is actually being formed in the 18th century when all these populations were living together. So one of the noteworthy Americans who moved to Detroit in the early 1800s was the New Englander Elijah Brush. Elijah Brush was a lawyer who was trained at Dartmouth College and relocated to the city to make his career and fortune. And he made both. He married John Askin's daughter Adelaide. Askin was one of the richest people in the area. And he acquired Askin's former farm on the Detroit River. If you can recall that map, I don't think I can get back to it. Let's see. Oh yeah, here it is. So if you can call this map here, they're the Richmond homes, right from your view on the left of Detroit, and there's the fort in the middle. And right to the right of Detroit is John Askin. So when Elijah Brush married John Askin's daughter, guess what he got? Askin's farm. That's where Elijah Brush was then located. Askin, again, had moved across the river to now living in Canada. They're all really still close and they visit across the river. So Elijah Brush is in a very good situation in Detroit. And he and his wife Adelaide turned out to be trendsetters for what was really a slow frontier town that had to wait weeks just to get mail and news from Cincinnati. So the Brushes ordered fashionable clothing as well as silver from upstate New York. And in their purchase orders, they say that it must be fashionable. This is their word, not mine. They complained that Detroit silversmiths were incompetent and that they were even cheats. They were the first people in town to order candy for their son and calash carriages. And they ordered all this from New York. A year after the Brushes ordered carriages, 3 other merchants in town ordered carriages. So Elijah Brush was a prominent figure. In 1805, Michigan became a separate territory, with Detroit designated as its capital. And Brush was elected fire inspector for the city. And he was commissioned lieutenant colonel of the Legionary Corps for the Michigan Territory. And he was appointed Solicitor General for the territory. Fairly soon after Brush was appointed to these different offices, a new governor and chief justice were appointed by Thomas Jefferson. The new governor of the territory, William Hall, and the new chief justice, Augustus Woodward, were en route to Detroit from New York and Washington, respectively, when disaster struck. In June of 1805, as they were on their way to Detroit, a fire broke out at Harvey's Bakery and burned the palisaded town to the ground. So the space in the large central margin area, you can't see the house there, but that would have been full of houses and buildings. But was just completely demolished. This is what an eyewitness said about the fire. Quote, "In less than 2 hours, the whole town was in flames, and before 3 o'clock, not a vestige of the house except the chimneys, visible within the limits of Detroit. The citadel and military stores were entirely consumed." So when Hull and his family and then Woodward arrived, they had to squat in the outlying farms, for months, as they devised a plan to reestablish the town they were supposed to come and kind of really run the territory from. That plan to reestablish the town caused a lot of controversy, as you can probably guess, for the residents, who were mostly French, were being confronted with these people who had been appointed from this new government to come and tell them what to do. There was a lot of tension and conflict and back and forth about rebuilding the town. So on the cusp of its grand moment, becoming the capital city of a newly designated territory, Detroit lay in ruins. The original French-Canadian-style dwellings of the town pickets were lost, and I suspect that Detroit remains to this day one of the few major colonial settlements that has no trace of its 18th century architectural heritage. I'm going to try to move us back to the left. All right, so in this image, you see, you're actually across the river. That's the Detroit River. You're in Canada. That's the Huron Church. the Native American church. And you see across the river, Detroit. This is before the fire. And I want to say too that these images that are really wonderful are coming from the work of Branigin, who has written a beautiful book of large-scale pictures of Detroit. And he works in the Clements Library on my campus, and it's been really great trying to help me understand the historiography of Detroit. So this is before the fire. After the fire, most of that across the river is going to be gone. So I have not yet been able to find any sources on how the fire of 1805 affected enslaved people in the city. It's probably not surprising that they're not mentioned in any of the literature that I have found on the fire. However, I think it stands to reason that enslaved people would have been deeply affected, homeless for a time, along with their owners, and charged with helping to physically rebuild the settlement. At the same time that slaves would likely have been disadvantaged in this moment of disaster, more vulnerable to the vagaries of chance and more susceptible to being assigned excess work as the city was being reconstructed, there's also an indication that slaves and people of color had some degree of legal standing or at least public regard in the city. And the fire actually creates opportunity for us to see this because all those town lots that were destroyed had to be reassigned. And when they were reassigned, people were being compensated for lost property. A few slaves received land along with their owners as part of that compensation. We haven't fully unpacked who they were and what that was about, but to me that's a sign that there was some kind of public regard for enslaved people in the city, at least in some situations. Now, perhaps because they recognized the chaotic aftermath of the fires as an opportunity, or perhaps because a recent treaty between the U.S. government and several Native groups has shifted the balance of land ownership in the area, giving Americans a greater range of jurisdiction in what had been a country dominated by Indian land title. I'll come back to that later if you'd like, that was a long phrase. But perhaps for these two reasons, Detroit saw a rash of slave freedom attempts and related court cases in 1806 and 1807. And I'm trying out an idea here. I'm not sure about this. So what I'm trying out is that the fire created chaos. And chaos always leads to greater attempts to run away from slavery. Because in addition, I'm trying out the idea that there's land shifting hands here. In the treaty between various Native groups, including Hurons, Potawatomis, Ottawas, and Ojibways, between these groups and the U.S. government in 1807, a large portion of southeast Michigan was ceded to the U.S. government. Southeast Michigan, all the way up to the Ohio border, was ceded. Now, I've seen one tiny indication that slave owners were reluctant to go after those slaves if they had to go through Indian territory to get them. So I'm linking these things together, and I'm just right now hypothesizing that this treaty, which means that there is less Indian territory, which means that there is kind of less space to maybe hide in if you're trying to run away. But this treaty might have led slaves to think, we better run now before the Americans get control of this land that we've been able to run through before. So in 1806, 1807, there were several runaway slave cases. And the story of the African-American Denison family is the most prominent in the historical record, probably because it was the first one. And it's the case that really set the standard for how slavery would be defined in Michigan. Before then, people were just doing it because they could do it, and there were loopholes in Jay Treaty that allowed them to do it. But it had not really been addressed directly before, who can be enslaved, and for how long. This case brought that before the court. So Peter and Hannah Denison were owned by William Tucker, who himself had been a transplant from Virginia. He'd been from a Virginia slaveholding family. William Tucker died in 1805, and in 1806, his widow, Catherine Tucker, indented Peter and Hannah to Elijah Brush for 1 year. Now, I told you a lot about Elijah Brush, and you remember him, I'm sure, his characters and his fashionable clothes. Elijah Brush was appointed one of the first mayors of Detroit at this time. There seemed to have been 2 mayors appointed, and he was one of them. So he was in a position of political power, economic power, he was a trendsetter, and he had access to slave labor, even though he was American and was not supposed to own slaves. So Peter and Hannah Denison were living with Elijah Brush, probably on that farm that I showed you, that said John Askin on the previous map, because now Askin's farm is Brush's farm. Meanwhile, Catherine Tucker kept Denison's children with her. And if you can imagine that map, she lived way, 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 way down the river. So her children, Denison's children were kept by Catherine Tucker at quite a distance. So during the year of their indenture with Elijah Brush, Peter and Hannah called Catherine Tucker to court. They brought suit against her, saying that their children should be free. And Elijah Brush, Solicitor General for the territory, represented them in this case. There's been speculation that maybe Brush suggested they bring this case to court. I'm not sure if he did or not, but I think it is significant that he knew the Denisons, that they were probably living in very close quarters with him, and that he is the one who represented them in the case. So in deciding the case, Justice Augustus Woodward cited the ordinance of 1705, that French ordinance that I mentioned earlier, having to do with slavery. So he cited French law, saying that slavery was legal in the French territories. And then he makes a ruling, which is taking into account the international location of Detroit. And I'm going to read it to you. He says, quote, "The laws of France and Upper Canada ceased to have any effect in this territory almost immediately after July 11, 1796. But under Jay's treaty, settlers continued to enjoy their property of every kind. The term property, as used in Jay's treaty, includes slaves, as slaves were recognized as property by the countries concerned. Slaves living on May 31, 1793, and in the possession of settlers in this territory on July 11, 1796, continue such for life. Children of such slaves, born between these dates, continue in servitude for 25 years. Children of such children, and all born after July 11, 1796, are free from birth." So kind of a confusing, graduated ruling that basically says some people who are in Detroit are going to still be slaves forever, some will be slaves for 25 more years, and some will be free. Because the eldest Denison children had been born between 1793 and 1796, they were consigned to slavery for life under this ruling. Their younger brother, Peter, would be relegated to slavery for another 25 years. Hannah and Denison had actually been freed after their year of indenture with Elijah Brush. So we've got free parents, children who are going to be enslaved for a portion of time, and children who are going to be enslaved for life. Not a good situation for the Denison family, so a number of them ran away to Canada. So meanwhile, as the Denison children fled from Detroit into Canada, Black and Native slaves owned by a Canadian merchant named Richard Pattinson were fleeing from Canada to Detroit. So Jenny was a mixed race woman of African descent, and Joseph Quinn was an Indian slave, and they together made it across the Detroit River to safety in Detroit, where Pattinson sought to have Michigan forcibly arrest them and send them back to him. But in this case, Judge Woodward decided that the court had no obligation to return fugitives from the foreign jurisdiction. So while the Denison children were still enslaved, the Pattinson slaves could be free as long as they lived in Michigan. There's another major case that's brought in the same time having to do with Matthew Elliott, who was a slaveholder also in Ontario. He lost 8 slaves who ran to Detroit. He tried to get them back, and Woodward said, "See the Pattinson case." So to summarize these cases, in Detroit, slavery was legal, but freedom was also possible. And slavery versus anti-slavery positions were not so firmly entrenched that a prominent lawyer, Elijah Brush, could not argue both sides. Now, even as Woodward decided these 3 landmark cases about slavery, the possibilities of the range of action for slaves in Michigan and Detroit was taking a surprising turn. There had been a standoff between U.S. and British warships in Virginia, known as the Chesapeake Incident, and people around the country were getting alarmed there could be a conflict with Great Britain around the corner. So there's a lot of anxiety, especially in Michigan, which shares a border with British Canada. So Governor Hall, who was really worried about an Indian attack, sanctioned the organization of a militia company comprised of escaped slaves, many of whom were residing in Canada. This group was known as the Black Militia by Michigan officials. And the company was led by Peter Dennison, who was given the title Captain by Governor Hall. So remember, Dennison and his kids had escaped to Canada for a period of time because of the rules that didn't go their way. And now there's a problem brewing. Governor Hall is getting anxious. So he turns to these black slaves in Canada and says, hey, want to come be a militia and help protect Detroit? And he appoints Peter Dennison as the head of this militia. All of the references to the militia in the records talk about this being a black militia, but given that it was formed of slaves in Canada, and that slaves in Canada and Detroit were both black and native at this time, I think we have to leave the possibility open that there were some native men in this militia as well. This militia company, according to Hall, quote, frequently appeared under arms, made considerable progress in military discipline, and manifested on all occasions an attachment to our government. So although I don't have evidence of this, I think it's possible that Elijah Brush had something to do with Peter Dennison being named captain of the militia, because Elijah Brush, you'll recall, had a major appointment in the territorial military. So now I'm going to skip quickly ahead because I've been given the time sign by Professor McCluskey. I'm going to skip ahead to say that I haven't found any mention of this black militia being involved in the War of 1812. However, I find it difficult to believe that a trained military company that was armed and was guarding Detroit in 1807 would stand idly by while the city was under siege during the War of 1812, which it was. So I haven't found this out yet, but I want to investigate where was this militia of former slaves during the War of 1812. So the complexity of outcomes for freedom suits in the Michigan Territorial Court, as well as the existence of Detroit's, quote, black militia, evidence both the fact of slavery in Detroit and the unexpected nature of the phenomenon. Detroit has long been a multicultural, multiracial border city where relations across and between groups had to be constantly negotiated in the context of unstable circumstances. Detroit's history then is one of recreation, of making and remaking itself through the labor and ingenuity of the motley crew of people who forged new lives in that frontier city of their own accord or by compulsion. Oops, the brush home. You didn't see it earlier. So in today's public discussion of the fate and expected collapse of Detroit, much attention is paid to the ruins of the city, the glorious buildings from an early 20th century heyday that now appear as aged and crumbling relics. So many images have been captured and consumed of Detroit's abandoned factories, windowless towers, and burned out homes that the genre has been assigned the critical appellation ruin porn. This Michigan Central Railway Station is now an icon of that genre. You see it everywhere. However, the history of early American Detroit makes clear that now is not the first time the city has seemed a ruin. It was so after the fire of 1805, and also during the War of 1812, when Governor turned Brigadier General William Hull surrendered the city to the British. But as the bold actions of black and native runaway slaves and militiamen of color show, even in a place riddled with unjust class and racial divisions, creative resistance and indeed resilience is possible. Thank you very much.
And now open for a question.
What would you like to say? Would you like to leave? That's fine. Bye. Thank you for coming.
Is any of what you shared with us today being taught in Michigan or in Detroit schools today? You know,
That's a good question, which I don't know the answer. But I can say that I have seen very little of this anywhere. I was surprised when I started this project to find so little secondary material out there about it. There was a recent, very brief newspaper article in an online publication that was called Detroit's Big Bad Secret, and it was about this. But for the most part, people don't know. And in that article, the person who wrote it, Bill McGraw, interviewed some people who were descended from slaveholders, and they had no idea that their families had owned slaves in Detroit. So I don't know, but I would guess no.
Can I just add to that? I grew up in Detroit, and I went to one of the schools in the city, and we actually talked somewhat about this. I mean, we were talking about the Woodward family, the Brush family, the Macomb family. And I just thought it was kind of funny that it always was ironic to me that we would cherish Macomb County and Woodward and all these names when they really didn't have a very good starting.
When did,
So
when did you go to school? When?
when,
Yeah.
70s through till about 83.
Do you happen to remember in what context you learned about this? Was it, I mean,
It was in our like in our
High
history
school?
classes.
High school
Yeah,
history?
like junior high and grade school. I mean, it wasn't to the depth that you're coming up with,
Yeah,
but it
but it
was
was
more
like-
about, you know, making sure that we understood our city and that we actually had a connection to the city and remembering, you know, where this city started,
It's
so.
interesting to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing that I had not realized before doing this project is, as you said, the place names.
Mhm.
The place names, they're slaveholders' names. And even
Right.
the streets now in downtown Detroit basically map onto the stripping farms that I showed you. So where you would see the name of, these are their French names, but the name of a person on the farm, that's now the name of the street. And most of them are slaveholders. It's kind of surprising. Yeah, in the back.
I'm also from Detroit. I went to school, but I attended, no, we didn't learn anything about any of those things. We learned more about the Industrial Revolution in Detroit as far as how the big three affected our city, but we learned nothing.
Okay.
Elementary through middle school, and that was directly in the city, and that was in the township for high school.
Okay.
So, but we didn't learn anything.
And when was that you were in school?
I'm sorry?
When was that you were in school?
2004.
Okay. Interesting.
Very
You
different
know,
generation.
you know my data, but you know, there's a gap there. Other comments, thoughts? Yes.
Do you have any sense of like the transition from knowledge of it? When this would have happened, there would have been a transition from a knowledge about this early history to kind of the celebratory story of being, you know, a northern state or that could be a really complicated process, but it just would be interesting, you know, in what decade.
Now I know where I know you're from.
Yeah.
Yes, it's great to see you. Great question.
Yeah.
We wrote a panel together several years ago. I don't know, but I find it really interesting. In the early history of Detroit, and there really aren't a lot, to tell you the truth, but the early kind of comprehensive histories that were published, like in the 19 teens and 20s, things like that, mention it. So they are more aware of it than the later histories. They also mention the abolitionist movement then. So I don't know when a time would be when one narrative is ascendant and one narrative is actually an interesting question.
Have you had any interest with the Detroit Free Press or News in running an expose on what you've just presented?
Expose, wow, that's a scary word. No, I haven't. I happened to be on the radio talking about just a little bit of this maybe last week, and maybe in the summer on NPR, because there was a show that was doing a series of stories on Detroit. But I tried to say then, this is so speculative, it's so new, I really don't know. And that's still how I feel some months later. I mean, I'm starting to get a grasp of it, but I'm not confident enough yet of what I have and what it means.
But eventually,
But not an expose, because I feel like,
well, I probably picked the wrong term, but it's kind of what it is.
yeah, well, that's the difficult
It's
thing.
like
I mean,
the reality
Right.
versus the fiction.
that's the hard thing about this
Yeah.
topic. Because as I said, that recent article that was on an online newspaper was called Detroit's Big Bad Secret. I don't feel like Detroit needs any more big bad secrets revealed about it. It doesn't need that. So that's why I'm trying to have the upward arc at the end. And if I do get far enough of this material that I can publish on it, I want to try to find an arc that doesn't just, just continue to tar
To push
Detroit.
it down.
Right.
Yeah.
With a negative brush. Okay, maybe I'll start at the front and then go all the way back, so there's sort of a line.
I think it's also important to point out that Detroit's not unique in this regard, because Indiana is also part of
Yeah.
Northwest
Mhm.
Ordinance. And I think what you've really shown is the persistence of slavery, the ambiguities involved in slavery that last almost up until the Civil War, actually. And I think it's really particularly useful, your insight about how these lines between slavery and freedom weren't so stark really until the 1840s. That it's, as you said, fuzzy or more like a patchwork even when you have all these indigenous communities that are all over until removal. So I want to say thanks and also give a bigger picture of how Indiana's also involved in the same kind of
Thank you.
story.
Right, I know Indiana's history, but the loophole pertains to this place too. So who knows what's happening? It's only you know in the room. I'm gonna just move down. You can't see each other, but there's a line of you, like, right, close right
I
back.
actually
So-
have an answer to the Indiana question.
Okay,
So I looked it up very quickly while you were
Okay.
talking about this. So there were 120 slaves in Knox County in 1820. And so that's in the southwest border. So, but that's about it. I mean, that maybe one other county with a handful.
Did you happen to
So-
see what they were doing there?
No,
Why
I
not?
just looked it up on a census
Oh,
browser.
okay.
right
Okay.
now.
That'd be
So,
interesting
but
to
I'm
see
very curious.
what industry, right, what was bringing them up to the county. Okay, there's somebody in front of you, and then I'm gonna come back to you.
I was wondering if this may be out, kind of beyond the chronology you want to deal with, but what happens if you bring the story up to the Civil War? And is there, by that time, a substantial, African American and Afro-Caribbean community in and around Detroit that takes interest in fighting in one way or another?
Yes. I can't take it all the way up to the Civil War. I'm not there yet, and I probably won't get there in this project. But the black population of Detroit really starts to grow in the 1840s, and of course, it just keeps pushing out over time.
Is there a sense that growth is natural or kind of organic with the pre-existing community, or is it immigration?
It's immigration, most definitely, from the South. Was there another part of the question?
No.
Okay.
And you may not be able to answer this, but I was wondering today, are there partnerships between U of M and Detroit that are working toward revitalization in the city?
Yeah, this is probably what inspired this project. I told you one story. There are always many stories where one kind of stands in for the whole. But there are lots of ways that I entered this project. One way was through my class I told you about. Another way was through reading the work of a colleague of mine in Native American history that is talking about the Great Lakes area as a native place all the way into the early mid-1800s. And that made me just rethink the picture I had. I was thinking, okay, if black people are running away from their enslavement, where are they running? They're running through native spaces, and what does that mean? So that's part of this project. Another contributing factor was Christina Snyder's book, which really opened my eyes to think about how Native American slavery could be in lots of places that we might not expect. And another, coming back to your question, another inspiring factor was that on our campus right now, there is a lot of discussion about Detroit. We do have kind of a satellite building in Detroit where events are held and we maintain an office. But on campus right now, there's an initiative to try to develop the concept of a Detroit School of Urban Studies. And it's an initiative that started off as a partnership among sociology, urban planning, Afro-American and African studies, and social work. And now, of course, it's growing in lots of different areas across campus. And we have a lecture series going on right now. The first person who's come to speak is George Galster. That's why I've been reading his book. And I think that just this attempt to work across disciplinary lines and to think about Detroit in a way that's collective is just inspiring projects. So that's part of it too.
Hi, great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you were going to get into, with this research, I'm thinking about the earlier part of your presentation about sort of Detroit's identity now and its sort of overall morale, right? And how really kind of deflated it is. And I'm wondering if you are looking into sort of drawing connections between if and when Detroit has a sort of a better idea of how it got there, how it can inform an identity that will want to sort of revitalize itself. So what I guess, I remember what your introductor was saying, that you're an activist as well. So I'm sort of wondering, I'm sure you have an idea of what you want to sort of accomplish with this, your sort of greater picture. So I just wondering about, is that something that you're looking at right now or thinking about?
It's a really great question. I would say I'm an activist makes me sound a little too active, and I wish I were more active. Instead, I'd say that I've started a community organization that educates girls in Southeast Michigan environmental
I
issues.
think that qualifies.
Maybe so, I think so. So I am interested in this question, very much so, but I'm not sure how it's going to enter into the project. I brought it together in this presentation. I'm really intrigued by it. I think that it's meaningful to try to make connections between the past and the present. However, I haven't decided yet what the relationship will be between the present and this really, really early period that I'm looking at. I don't want to lose my bearings on the one because of the other, and that's possible. I think that probably what I'm reaching for, if I can't find it, I won't be able to say it, right? I mean, it depends on what I can find out there in the sources. But probably what I'm reaching for would be models for early Detroit that can be inspiring. I mean, it's not all going to be good. It never is. It's never all good. African American, Native American people have suffered and struggled for a long time. And yet there are these moments that stand out and they're worth highlighting. And to me, the Black Militia, I had to give a little less of that because I talked too much about good things, but the Black Militia is an interesting configuration, interesting moment where you have a white American governor who's desperate enough to have armed black men come and patrol his kind of capital city. That's pretty unusual. That's probably unique. I think it's unique. And so,
No, I said I would think so.
so I think there are moments in this story, in this research, that can be brought to bear. Not that I'm trying to say that Detroiters, get guns and no, and control the city. But I'm just saying that there are things that happen that are unexpected, that can inspire unexpected moves right now.
Okay, well, let's thank Professor Miles once again.